Hi everyone, and welcome to a brand new unit. So in Unit 3, we talked about land-based empires, and, the gunpowder empires. So Unit 4 naturally has to be the sea-based empires, aka Europe. So this first topic that we are going to cover is exploration, causes and events. So we are really looking at topics 4.1 and 4.2 in this lecture today. So we're talking about the diffusion of technology that facilitated the changes in patterns. We're going to look at some, very significant technology that we have talked about in the past from the classical Islamic and Asian worlds. And we're going to see, how these new tools were put in place and fueled exploration. So we've seen this graphic before. We talked about how Dar Islam and China walked through these different technologies so that Europe could take it and just run with it. So what technology really facilitated trade during this time period? Well, we looked at the different ships. We looked at the use of monsoon winds to push these ships, these Chinese junks and dhows. We also looked at the astrolabe, which would significantly change the way people would use ships and explore the world around them, as well as the magnetic needle or compass. So, really, knowledge and scientific learning and technology from those classical Islamic and Asian worlds helped spread and facilitate Europe to take these items and continue to develop them and make them better or improve upon them. So here you have, the compass from China. We have the Latin sails that were Arabs or from the Malays, and then you had astronomical charts that were taken from Arabs and the Chinese and improved upon to be able to give Europe the ability to explore. So these are some diagrams from the Muslim world about the astrolabe and the compass and how to use it. This is a star chart. So this was from the astronomer Su Song, and he mapped out the celestial globe, meaning the stars in relation to where you are on the globe. And these were the south polar projections that he came up with. So, what were some of the causes that, allowed this time period to happen? Well, we know that the Crusades opened up Europe into the East once again. You had those Mongol invasions that carried over the gunpowder. You had diasporic merchant communities that allowed for the blending of cultures. You also had the Muslims in Spain that had a significant impact on the Spanish. You had these extensive trade networks, Jesuit missionaries who went into East Asia, and then, of course, just the expansions of empires in general. So let's start to look at the technology. So first up is the Latin sails and the dhow ships. So we know that the dhow was made for sailing in the Indian Ocean, and they were not made for very long voyages. The Chinese junks were made from large, flat bottoms to carry lots of tributes and cargo to the Chinese. So neither one of these ships were able to make the distances. You also had the caravel from the Spanish, you had the carack, and then you had this new thing come about, which was the flute. And that was a new ship that was designed during this period, and it was made to go those long distances. Um, During this time, because they were still using the sails, right? They had to use the wind and the currents to be able to understand where they were going. So understanding the Atlantic currents was extremely crucial for European exploration. Unlike the monsoon winds in India, these currents are fixed all year round. So if you are in this current, it could take you to and from your destination. So as you can see in the Atlantic Ocean, you kind of have this very cyclical current that's going on here. In the cold water, it can push you south. The warm water can push you north, or depending on where you're at, the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa can actually push you south. And this should look a little familiar when we start talking about the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, North America, and Europe. They are actually using all of these currents to be able to carry them along. They also started to compile practical knowledge of currents and wind patterns that could affect maritime navigation. So they created this giant wind wheels, and they noticed that this existed both in the Atlantic and the Pacific. So the arrows that you're seeing on the map, that's the wind currents. So knowing how these wind currents operate could also make traveling easier and faster to new and different worlds. So let's look at the 1450s to 1750s. So this is 4.2. All right. So all of these learning objectives. All right. So where we left off. And between the 1200 and 1500 time period, Europe saw an increase in commerce and connections to Eurasia. Thank you, Crusades. There were no connections to the Western Hemisphere, however, the Americas, this unknown world. But this changes with Columbus's voyages in 1492. And this so began what's called a modern age with a truly connected global network of exchange, because it would establish a global economy, global empires, a global cultural exchange, and also with it, global conflicts. Industrialization and political revolutions would soon follow after exploration. I do want to point out to you, though, that while College Board and a lot of other historical, entities, particularly in relation to your education and academia, have not quite caught up with the world we live in today. Everybody gives Christopher Columbus the he first discovered the Americas title, even though we all know that the Vikings and the Chinese were here way before Columbus was. So I'm throwing in that little asterisk, okay? So, why Europe? Well, Europe had the better proximity to the Atlantic Ocean. It had more competition between the states, which drove innovation and exploration. They also really took the time for map making, navigation, and ship design, thanks to these ideas that you see from the East. And once they had access to these new colonies, they also had new resources, which further drove and funded their exploration and colonization efforts. And not only this, but the main goal that the Europeans had was to access the Indian Ocean, because the Muslim and Chinese and Indians already had access to it, and now Europe was trying to find a way into it. That's how all of this got started. They weren't seeking out new lands, they were seeking out a new way to get to the spices in the Indian Ocean. So the Europeans were really motivated by competition and rivalries. They didn't like each other. This is where you start to see the growth of nationalism come into play. They also saw the threat of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire set between Europe and the East. And they were also making strides to develop technology just like Europe. You also see this growing merchant class in Europe. They wanted to increase their trade and their wealth. And there was just this demand for easy access into the Indian Ocean because they couldn't bypass the Muslim intermediaries. Then you also have the God aspect of things, the missionary and crusading zeal. They wanted to spread Christianity, and this really came with the Catholic Jesuits. So, in summary, you have the God glory and gold. They wanted to spread their religion. They wanted the glory of getting there. And then they wanted to increase their wealth. That's pretty much the summary of the age of explorations, or age of exploration. So let's look at the Portuguese. So this is where we start to see baby steps being made or taken to get to the height of exploration. So we all know Prince Henry the Navigator. In the 15th century, he wanted to spread Christianity and also increase Portugal's power in the world. So he was absolutely fascinated with all things sailing, and he promoted maritime developments. He was able to seize the Moroccan city of Ceuta, and this boosted their confidence. So then he conquered uninhabitable islands of Madeira and Azores, which they ended up colonizing. So think of this as a trial version of the large-scale colonization that would come very quickly. On these islands, they were able to cultivate sugarcane, which kind of increased the development for the taste of sweets and sugar. This was in high demand because they didn't have a lot of access to the sugar. And because of this, they were actually able to explore the West African coast a lot more and began trading guns and textiles and other manufactured goods for African gold and slaves. Let's see where I'm going with this one. This ultimately caused an increase in demand for slaves. And so they began transporting them to the Atlantic islands to work as laborers. But some were also taken as household slaves in Europe. So chattel slavery, kind of blame on the Portuguese. So Henry the Navigator was really the first one to lead all of these ventures. He sponsored studies and development of navigation. Jewish cartographers or employed Jewish cartographers. They studied and improved the navigation technologies. They better developed the compass and the astrolabe. And they pushed for advancements in ship design. This is where we get the caravel. So it was smaller than the Chinese junk, but the size allowed exploration of shallow coastal areas. And they were also strong enough to withstand terrible storms. And there were two sets of sails. The square was able to catch the breeze for speed, but the lateens made it able to make the ship more maneuverable. And then you had cannons that were able to take down enemy ships. So they not only made these huge ships for exploration, but they also made huge ships as precursor to the battleships. So in case you need to know where Madeira and the Canary Islands are, so this is Madeira, the Canary Islands. This is Azores, and the sugarcane that is developed on the islands to this very day. So the Portuguese went exploring. We talked about how they traded goods, right? And with that came the demand of slaves. This ultimately set the precedent for African slaves being exported to work on agricultural plantations. Wow. There was also Portuguese movement down the coast of Africa, and this becomes a common European pattern. And because the Portuguese started doing this, they actually set up trading stations along the west coast of Africa. And along these trading posts, one of the significant things would be the slave trade. So we actually see the Portuguese starting to set up this small scale maritime empire. So all of the green that you see here, all of these labeled places, this is what the Portuguese controlled at the beginning of exploration. They would ultimately lose it. So this is a picture, or this is the image of a Portuguese soldier. He is wearing a 16th century European costume with a steel helmet. He's, got a sword. He carries a flintlock gun. Guns were new to the people of West Africa when Portugal came along. So Africans traded them from Europeans and learned how to make them themselves to help them in their wars against people who still only had hand weapons and bows and arrows. So sometimes the kings of Benin, so one of the cities in West Africa, even employed Portuguese soldiers like this man to fight as mercenaries in their wars. So figures of Europeans, such as this Portuguese soldier, were kept in royal altars on roofs of the royal palaces throughout Benin City. You can watch that video. All right, so the Portuguese ultimately gained access to the Indian Ocean. So West Africa was not enough. The Portuguese wanted Indian Ocean. The spices, hello. They wanted to avoid Muslim and Italian middlemen. So they had to go through Italy and into the Middle East. So in 1488, Bartholomew Diaz sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Indian Ocean. Unfortunately, the route that he took was long, it was demanding, it had all sorts of issues. So in 1497, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and ended up on the eastern side of Africa, where Muslim sailors helped him to understand the monsoon winds that would ultimately take him into India. And just a year later, he would arrive in Calcutta, and then he would return to Lisbon with cargo of pepper and spices. So the issue between these two routes is that you see here, Diaz in orange is hugging the coast of Africa. Well, if you don't know anything about the winds in the coastline, is the winds are going to push you into the coast along with the current of the ocean, which means there's a lot of sickness. You have to stop a lot. It's not really great. So what Da Gama did is he sailed away from Africa and made it to the Cape of Good Hope. And this would actually turn out to be a much faster and a much better way. He used the currents and the winds to propel him around Africa. And then he was able to access the eastern coast and ultimately Calcutta or Calcut, sorry, I call it Calcutta, in India. And this is illustrations of how Europeans understood the world. So here is Europe and here is Africa. And then this is Asia. And here again, you have the eastern seaboard of the United States now. You have what they understood of South America, and then Africa and Asia. Oh, it's so interesting seeing these first maps that they created. So Portugal gains access. Bum, bum, bum. So the Portuguese merchants and sailors would end up dominating the Indian Ocean. They attempted to control all the shipping and it was enforced with superior ships and cannons. They overpowered the Arabs, Persians, and Indians and Southeast Asians. And this essentially was the beginning of European imperialism in Asia, and it would go downhill for Asia after this. Meanwhile, while all of this was going on with Portugal, the Spanish were employing Italian mariner Christopher Columbus to sail to the Americas. So the King of Portugal actually declined to sponsor Columbus, and so he went to the Spanish King and Queen, Ferdinand and Isabella. And they ultimately decided to sponsor his voyage. He left in 1492 with 3 ships that landed in San Salvador. This is Watling Island in the Bahamas. And it took them 3 months to get there. And he thought he had found India. That's the reason why they call Native Americans Indians, is because Christopher Columbus was not that bright. He, on his deathbed, swore to you that he had found India, even though it was a new place. That is the reason why we live in America and not Colombia. Stop, ran over. All right. So the news spread quickly, and new explorers rapidly followed in his place because he brought back all of these goods from the New World. So here are the 4 different voyages that Columbus took between the New World and Spain. One of my favorite memes. It's actually on my wall in my classroom. Is this Beerja? I love a good meme. But as we know that Christopher Columbus was not the first. Columbus it was for a long time believed to be the first to reach the New World. But, evidence came much later that revealed he was beaten by the Viking named Leif Erikson in the 11th century. Ha ha. So why the heck do we have Columbus Day and not Leif Erikson Day? It's total BS. So Columbus did inspire other explorers and other empires to seek out new riches and access to the Asian markets. So here you can see a map of how everything went. So you have the explorers that we have talked about already, right? You have Prince Henry, Diaz, Columbus, Cabot, da Gama, Cortez, Magellan, Pizarro, and Cartier. These are all of the major explorers from the Age of Exploration. And you can see that Zhengji here, right? And then everybody else. So European exploration really did go way further than everybody else. And the Spanish and the Portuguese were dominating the world until their ultimate decline. Wah, wah, wah. What about the Netherlands? What about everybody else? Well, the Netherlands and everybody else wanted a piece of it too. So like the Portuguese, they wanted trading posts on the Asian coast. So they conquered Malacca in 1641, seizing a Portuguese site. And they operated from Cape Town, Colombo, in Batava, or Jakarta, known today. And they had faster, cheaper, and more powerful ships than the Portuguese did. So this is where you have the establishment of what's called joint stock companies. And the one the Dutch had was called the United East India Company. And it was founded in 1602. Private merchants used their funds to start the companies with government support, but they were still fully privately owned. And thus they could buy, sell, build trading posts, and make war in the company's interest. And they were very successful and extremely profitable. If their voyages were a success, they doubled the investments for the people who invested in their expeditions. So what about the Dutch in North America? Well, the Dutch also wanted a route to Asia, so they would send the Dutch East India Company across the Atlantic to find a route to Asia, similar to Christopher Columbus, or through North America. So at this time, no one knew how large North America was, so they really did fund these expeditions in hope of finding a shorter route, an easier route into Asia. So they explored America's rivers and bays. They hired British explorer Henry Hudson to find a northwest passage into Indies. And as they explored, they would claim the territories in the name of the Dutch East India Company. And they claimed the lands in modern day United States and Canada. So the reason why I put an emphasis on Hudson is because in New York, they have the Hudson River, which Henry Hudson sailed up. And New York was at one point in time New Amsterdam. New York State was New Holland, and New York City was New Amsterdam. Just so you know. Well, the British had to get in on this. They couldn't let everybody else have a piece of the pie. So they established their own joint stock company called the British East India Company in 1600. And they concentrated on India. And they set up posts at Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta. Their exploration of North America began in the late 15th century. While everybody else was focusing on America in the early 1600s, or 1400s, I'm getting confused now. Sorry, you guys. While everybody else was concentrating on North America, the British were like, y'all can have it for a little while. We're going over here. Sir Walter Raleigh had actually briefly established the Roanoke colony in 1585. And we know that that ultimately has a lot of problems. Jamestown was actually the first successful permanent colony that the British had set up in North America, and this became known as the colony of Virginia. I fight people who say that Jamestown was the first successful colony because that is not true. St. Augustine in Florida was the first successful colony in the Americas, but it was not the first British colony. Jamestown was. So that's the reason why we talk about Jamestown instead of St. Augustine, is because the British would end up becoming the winners, and history is written by the winners. We'll talk more about it. So what about the French? The French obviously want to get a little piece of the action too. So the Spanish success in the Caribbean also motivated the French. So they wanted to expand Catholicism around the globe. So the French sent navigator Jacques Cartier to claim the northern portion of North America in the name of France. And they wanted to call it New France. So annoying. So Samuel de Champlain explored the Caribbean in 1601 and the coast of New England in 1603. And they ultimately founded Quebec in 1608. And this was to be commercially a viable outpost to harvest furs. And they would do it with beaver pelts. So this is what it looked like for each of these different empires and what control they had in North America. As you can tell, the Spanish and the French were winning this one, while the British were too busy concentrating on East Asia. So let's talk about a little bit about Japan for a second. So the Portuguese traders and missionaries, mainly the Jesuits, arrive in Japan in the 16th century, followed by the Dutch, the Spanish, and the English. Japan at this point was decentralized. They were in constant internal conflict, and the Japanese welcomed European gunpowder with open arms. And this actually led to a growth of Christianity in Japan. Well, things would quickly change, however, as Japan would unify under the Tokugawa shogunate. So the shoguns and the government officials began to view Europeans as a threat. They thought that the Europeans would come in and completely erase Japanese culture and take away the power of the shoguns. So they expelled Christian missionaries, and they violently suppressed Christians and anybody who practiced Christianity. They even went to the point of executing missionaries, and the Japanese would not give up practicing their faith, or any Japanese that would not give it up. They would ban Western books. Shoguns forbid Japanese from traveling abroad. They banned European merchants and travelers. The only ones that had access was the Dutch, and they could only go in one port, as we saw from the history of Japan. For 200 years, the Japanese would practice isolationism, even though they would continue to trade with China, Korea, and other countries in Southeast Asia. They said Europeans, GTFO. They meant it. So this is an image or painting of what the Dutch trading port looked like in southern Japan. Like, they could only go here, nowhere else. So how did Chinese and European motives for maritime exploration differ? Well, from one, the Japanese were convinced that the world of Chinese economics and culture were much more superior. And they were gaining prestige for Japan because they instituted a tribute system. They weren't looking to colonize, they were just looking to bring people in and allow them to live out their own life. Whereas Europeans wanted access to the Indian Ocean specifically for trade because there was a demand for luxury goods. And they were forced into it because they were, we can't let our neighbors be more powerful for us. They also wanted to spread their faith. And Europeans ultimately just wanted fame and glory for themselves and their empire. This is where nationalism, again, comes into play. And we'll talk more about that later. Bye, everybody.